All right, so this will be the lecture for two sections in the notes entitled Central European Monarchs Clash and Absolute Rulers of Russia. All right, we're going to start with absolute rulers in the rest of Europe. We've looked at Spain, we've looked at France, let's look at the rest of Europe, let's look at Russia, and then the next section will be all about England because theirs is a little different than everybody else's. All right, let's start off with conflict here in Europe. There was, as we've seen from previous sections in the previous unit, lots of religious conflict going on in Europe. And in the part of the world that today is called Germany, there was particularly a lot of religious conflict going on. It's kind of where religious conflict was born during the Protestant Reformation. And one conflict that was at its core about religious freedom was called the 30 Years' War. And again, as it says there, this is a fight over religious freedom in the Holy Roman Empire. That's future Germany. It was decided by a document called the Peace of Westphalia, which we'll get to in a second. All right, the Protestants had some help from above to emerge victorious in this war. And that help from above came in the form of this leader from Sweden. His name was Gustavus Adolphus, who was a Lutheran, Protestant, and so he sent his army down to help the Lutherans or the Protestants in Germany, which resulted in their victory in the 30-Year War. There's some pretty important things that happened as a result of the agreement to end the 30 Years' War. Again, that's called the Peace of Westphalia. So, consequence number one, Spain and France were weakened, or Spain and Austria were weakened as a result of this conflict. France was actually strengthened as a result of this conflict, so a stronger country going forward. Austria and Spain a little weaker, France a little bit stronger. And we also see that there were princes and nobles in Germany that wanted to be Protestant, and their kings wanted to remain Catholic, and so that's the source of the conflict. Well, after this war, those princes earned the right to practice whatever religion they wanted, and they determined it for their particular kingdom. This is also going to set the stage for the future establishment of the future nation of Germany. All right, and this is the last war fought for religious reasons in Europe. Wars will be fought for more conventional reasons going forward, like power or hatred or leader with a megalomaniac personality. In any case, these are some important consequences that happened as a result of the Peace of Westphalia. Some other changes that happened throughout Europe after this war. A new ruling family came to power in the nation of Austria. It's kind of a historically powerful name. These are the Habsburgs, and they're going to be rulers in Austria and Eastern Europe for several hundred years. One of the most famous Habsburg leaders of Austria was this woman, Maria Theresa. Took over after her father died. All right, another European absolutist leader of Prussia, and this nation existed as one of the strongest Germanic kingdoms after the 30 Years' War. They're going to be largely responsible for uniting all Germanic kingdoms to become the country of Germany a little bit later on. But this is Frederick the Great. He made Prussia a threat in Europe by having, as it says in our notes, the largest army in Europe at the time, and made Prussia a important but kind of militaristic partner in European history. All right, so the same sort of trend of trying to take away power from each other or outmaneuver each other extended into this era, and there was a conflict when Prussia tried to take lands from Austria, and the reason for that was that the leader of Prussia didn't respect the female leader of Austria, and so once her father died and she became the leader, Prussia went in and thought, hey, we'll just take Austria's land. I guess they figured she's weak, she's a woman, she won't be able to stop us. But she actually got on a horse and rode out there and led her troops against the Prussians and were victorious. But this conflict was called the War of the Austrian Succession. You can kind of see where Prussia is located, up in here, where Austria is located, and then the disputed territory between the two of them. All right, other wars were fought during this time too, other countries fighting for control in the world. There was a war called the 7 Years' War that was fought between the British, the Spanish, and the French, and it all spilled out into their colonies that existed all over the world. So they fought in the New World, they fought in India, they fought in Europe. It was kind of one of the first world wars ever. And next year, when you get to U.S. history, you'll see this war from the colonist perspective. They called it the French and Indian War, but it was the same war that brought in a large part of the world. All right, so that's what's going on in Europe. Let's take a look over and look and see what's going on in Russia at the time. We haven't said too much about Russia to this point, and there's a reason for that. So let's go into Russia. And this is the reason why we haven't really mentioned too much about Russia to this point. So they were behind the curve a little bit. They were still using feudalism, if you remember that from the Middle Ages, from like the 1000 to 1500s. The rest of Europe had gotten rid of feudalism. Probably about 500 years earlier, Russia was still using feudalism with serfs that worked the land and just an outdated social structure. Also, if we went earlier in history, we'd see that Russia was part of the Mongol Empire in the 1200s, and so they didn't evolve culturally the same way that Europe did that wasn't part of the Mongol Empire. Also, there's some pretty inhospitable geographic borders that go around Russia that kind of keep them isolated from their enemies. And thirdly, they were not Protestant. They were Protestant, but they weren't the form of Protestant that Europe was practicing. They practiced Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which was different than Catholicism, different than Protestantism, and they had broken away from the Catholic Church, so they didn't even have the same religious history as much of Europe. So these are the things that caused them to sort of have their own history off to the side and not have the same sort of advancements other European countries did. All right. One of the first leaders to help the Russian people rise up and take control of their own area was this guy. This guy is Ivan III, and he's going to be the first in a line of leaders that are referred to as czars. So if you look at our vocab word at the top, czar, a czar is the Russian title for their king, which means Caesar. It comes from the root that means Caesar. And so the leader of Russia is referred to as with this title of the czar. All right, Ivan III was able to accomplish a few important things for his country, for his people. He was able to carve out a chunk of land around the city of Moscow that could be called their own, and then unite the native Russian people together to overthrow the Mongols and completely push them out so they can rule themselves, and then also to start the basis for a Russian-led government that would rule over Russia and be their own instead of under the thumb of the Mongols. So these things were all done under the leadership of Ivan III as he helped Russia transition from Mongol colony to independent country. All right, I'm going to show you a picture of two Russian czars. These men are both czars of Russia. They look very different. I want you to take a few minutes. You can stop the video if you want and make a bullet point list of some of the similarities and some of the differences you notice between these two leaders, these two czars of Russia. They're czars at about the same time, but there's clearly a difference between the two. So we'll talk about that one in class. All right, the leader on the left is known as Ivan IV, or as he was affectionately known by the people that were close to him, Ivan the Terrible. Kind of fits the description there. He did a lot of horrible things, none of which you have to write down, but as a leader, he lived up to his name. He had a secret police that would hunt down people that he felt were traitors and have them executed. He replaced the nobles with nobles that were loyal to him, so the wealthy people would support him. And then also he was known to have a bit of an anger issue. One day when his son disagreed with him, he killed him with his bare hands, and then this is a famous picture of him, I guess, feeling sorry for the decision that he made. So I guess that's what happens when your anger gets the best of you. So that's lovely Ivan the Terrible. One thing he did right for Russian history is he married well, and the wife that he took, her name was Anastasia Romanov, and the Romanovs are going to be the leaders of Russia all the way up until communism takes over. All right, and if you noticed on the previous slide, when you were comparing pictures, the greatest czar from the Romanov line is back to this guy, Peter I on the right. All right, when Peter became the Tsar of Russia, he recognized that Russia was behind the rest of Europe. So he made a purposeful effort to try to westernize Russia. So if we go into your vocab words, westernization, what that means is this: the changing of the Russian economy, government, culture, and religious affairs to be more like the West, which means Europe. So he made a purposeful effort to westernize Russia so they could get caught up to or on equal footing with what was going on in Europe at the time. Right, one way he did this is he went on a tour. He disguised himself as a peasant and he went on a tour throughout Europe trying to see what it is that they did and learn from them so that when he came back to Russia, he could transform the country. So there's several reforms that he brought back to Russia after this tour of Europe. I'm going to give you more than three. You only need to write down three, whichever three you want. You don't have to make space for the extras, but this is what he did. Right? So he ordered the nobles to give up their clothes that looked more Mongol and more Asian and adopt a style of clothing that looked more like a European. And you know how styles go, it usually starts with the wealthy and trickles down to everybody else. And so that was his way of kind of changing the culture of Russia. Another thing he did, right, brought in new foods that grew really well. Potatoes, it grows pretty easily. It grows pretty well at different times of the year. It's very filling. So this is a great resource to the Russian people. He started promoting ideas and education with this newspaper so people could read more, people would write more, the flow of ideas would go a lot smoother. Gave women an extended position within society, still not as equal as they probably should have been, but more so than they were. And he also upgraded the technology and the technology for the future. Schools to teach Russians new navigational ideas, artistic ideas, and scientific thought that was going through Europe that was normal to them. And the last thing that Peter did, this wasn't part of his tour, but he realized that if you know the geography of Russia, Moscow is kind of inland and it doesn't really connect to Europe all that well. So he had a new city built right on the water so that Russians could interact a little bit better and trade with and get on the trade routes that Europeans were using. And then he graciously offered his own name as the name for the new city, St. Petersburg. You can see where St. Petersburg is. So now they can interact a little bit better with Europe.